If you walk into a dealership in Shanghai and buy a gasoline car, it can take years until you can actually drive it. The problem is license plates. In big cities like Shanghai and Beijing, it's extremely difficult to get plates for a gasoline car. In some cities, you need to enter a lottery and win them. In others, you bid for them in an auction, and prices can climb into tens of thousands of dollars. But let's say you go back to the same dealership and buy an EV. All of a sudden, there's no lottery or auction. There's no waiting. You can register it on the spot and drive it out the dealership the same day. One type of car is restricted and the other is pushed forward. This is just one of the ways China has moved the country towards EV adoption, and it's just one part of a much bigger plan that has led China to the top of the EV game. So let's start from the beginning. In the 1980s, before electric cars and before Tesla, China tried to build a normal gasoline car industry. The plan was simple. Let foreign companies sell to the gigantic Chinese market, but make them share their knowledge. If companies like Volkswagen or General Motors wanted access to Chinese customers, they would have to partner with local firms. And at first, the plan seemed to work. Factories were built and cars rolled off the line, millions of them. And China did gain some knowledge of car manufacturing, but eventually they realized they still didn't have a good enough grasp on the most important parts of a car. The engine, the transmissions, the ECUs, the parts that actually mattered. China was assembling cars, but it wasn't truly learning how to build them. China began to realize that they weren't just behind, they were locked out. And things stayed that way until the early 2000s. About a decade earlier, in the beginning of the 1990s, a Chinese mechanical engineer named Wan Gang had earned his PhD in Germany. He got offers to work at some of the biggest car manufacturers, and ultimately he joined Audi. And he spent nearly a decade there inside their system. He didn't just see how German cars are made, he learned the trade and mastered it. So when he returned to China, his conclusion was blunt. China cannot win the race for a gasoline engine. The gap is just too wide and the knowledge is just too protected. Not only that, but the longer they play this game, the further they would fall behind. So he proposes something radical. Don't catch up. Skip it and start investing in something else. Electric cars. At the time, the idea seemed radical, but the more you think about it, the more it makes sense. EVs don't have complex engines. They're built with batteries, motors, and electronics. Those are all areas where China has more experience. And the government actually listened to Wan Gang, and in 2001, they made EV technology a national priority project. For the first time in the journey to become a competitor in the car industry, China wasn't behind. It was starting fresh. Instead of trying to close a 100-year gap, they stepped around it. But deciding to build electric cars is not nearly the same as having an industry. The first phase of China's EV development was slow and experimental. The government began by funding research, and then after that, they started running pilot projects. This led to 2008, when 50 all-electric buses were used in the Beijing Olympics. Then in 2009, they launched the 10 Cities 1,000 Vehicles program, where 1,000 electric vehicles were deployed in each of 10 major cities. The next year after that, BYD rolled out hundreds of electric buses and taxis in Shenzhen. That project was designed to allow BYD to collect performance data and generate steady revenue, even though the technology was still in its early stages. Piece by piece, the Chinese government built the foundation. The moves they made resulted in improved battery technology, the formation of a network of suppliers, and even defined standards. But the most important part is how they organized the manufacturing process. China built their car industry differently than anywhere else. Look at how a car is usually made. Design might happen in Germany, key parts might come from Japan or Korea, and batteries may come from somewhere else entirely. No matter where it's made, everything has to get shipped across oceans and then finally assembled. Each step depends on a different company, a different country, and a different timeline. Now, compare that to China. If you zoom into just one city, like Shenzhen or Dongguan, you'll find battery factories next to part suppliers, suppliers themselves will be next to assembly plants, and engineering teams work close to production lines. So regardless of what it is, if something needs to change, you don't need to wait weeks for a shipment. You just drive 10 minutes, fix it, test it, and run it again. Instead of a chain, it's a loop. Production is fast and constantly moving. And over time, that early investment compounds. By the early 2010s, China doesn't just have an EV idea anymore. It has the beginning of an EV system. A few years later, when demand for EVs finally starts to pick up, that early system begins to show itself. Companies begin entering the space, like a lot of companies. In 2014 and 2015 alone, more than 20 new EV companies were born, including future giants like NIO, XPeng, and Li Auto. And because all the suppliers and factories were already in place, those companies didn't have to start from zero. The foundation already existed, and all they had to do was just build on top of it. They were able to quickly ship out cars and place charging stations all across cities. For the Chinese consumer, it didn't feel like a slow rollout. It felt like a sudden explosion. In most countries, that kind of growth usually happens unevenly. One company moves, another falls behind, supply might lag behind demand, or demand might outpace supply. But in China, the pieces move in sync. And maybe more importantly, the government makes sure it stays that way. The price of electric cars come down because buyers get direct subsidies at the dealership, and in some cities, they don't even pay purchase tax. Electric cars get free parking in certain areas, and in 2015, the central government mandated that at least 10% of all parking spaces in new public buildings include charging ports, increasing access to charging stations. At the same time, the government also starts making gasoline cars harder to live with. It enacted stricter emissions rules to limit where they can drive, and some cities even went as far as to restrict driving them on certain days. The choice isn't neutral anymore. Demand is being propelled in one direction: adopt EVs. And as a result of the last decade of work China put into this, the supply is already there to follow it. Most explanations for China's EV dominance tend to focus on one aspect of the total system, but in reality, it's much more than any one part. It's the coordination of all the moving parts together. It's everything moving at the same time in the same direction. By 2019, China has already become the best place in the world to build EVs, and companies across the ocean are taking notice. Eventually, Tesla convinces the Chinese government to not only allow them to manufacture and sell cars in China, but to also waive the previous requirement for a joint venture agreement. In only 1 year, they build a fully owned gigafactory in Shanghai. Production ramps quickly, but the real shift happens behind the scenes. Tesla starts sourcing locally, and more of the car gets built inside China. Within a few years, most of its supply chain is local. Tesla isn't just operating in China, it's plugged into the system, no pun intended. For Tesla, that means speed, lower costs, and faster iteration. And for Chinese companies, it raises the bar. Now, they're not just competing with each other, they're competing with Tesla. But coincidentally, Chinese companies also gain a new source of information. They can now watch how Tesla builds, how it simplifies production, and how it integrates software. They can take all that new information, adapt it, and then push it further. So for China, Tesla serves as both a competitor and also a catalyst. And for the Chinese government, it means that the industry they've built isn't just fast, it's learning. But the industry the Chinese government had created soon turned out to be almost too good. At first, demand exploded. Millions of people wanted electric cars, and every company wanted to be the one to supply them. Manufacturers expanded and built the factories, they built the battery plants and supply chains, everything that was needed to support the demand. Dozens of new brands also entered the market at the same time, and for a while, everything worked perfectly. The cars kept getting better, and every year more people bought EVs than they had the year before. Companies assumed that the market would keep expanding at the same speed indefinitely, and they kept building for the future. But there was a problem. Factories take years to build, and supply contracts are signed years in advance. Once billions of dollars are invested into production capacity, you can't just stop it. So when the market started slowing down, production was still accelerating. The first wave of buyers had already entered the market, and the explosive early growth began turning into something more stable and more predictable. But the thing is, factories that were planned during the boom years were only now coming online. More cars began entering the market right as demand started cooling. And that's when the pressure begins to build. Once a factory exists, it has to produce. Workers need their salaries and suppliers need their orders. Loans need to be repaid, and when a factory sits idle, it just burns money. So what did China do? Well, they just kept making cars. It wasn't about building the best EV anymore. The goal now was just to move inventory and survive long enough to outlast the competition. By 2025, Chinese EV manufacturers had developed an estimated surplus of around 20 million vehicles. That's more than the size of the entire annual US car market. When something like that happens, prices don't fall as a strategy. They fall because there's literally no other choice. For example, BYD dropped the price of its Kin Plus DM-i car to just 79,800 yuan, or about $11,000. That's half the price of a Toyota Corolla. And when one company lowers their prices like that just to move inventory, then others have to follow just to stay competitive. That causes margins to start shrinking and profits to thin out. In China, there's a word for this: neijuan, involution. It describes a kind of competition where everyone works harder, but the overall outcome doesn't improve. Effort goes up, returns go down. And that's exactly what's begun to happen in China. There are dozens of companies. Of course, there's BYD, but there's also Geely, Chery, Leapmotor, NIO, Xiaomi, and the list goes on and on. They're all making relatively similar cars and all competing inside the same system. In this pressure cooker, it's the weaker companies that start to break first. They just can't sustain the price cuts and they wind up disappearing. Just recently, Evergrande NEV, once a titan of the EV boom, collapsed into bankruptcy, leaving behind 3 huge empty factories and $2 billion in debt. The same forces that made China dominant in electric vehicles are now pushing the system toward its limits. There's just too much capacity and too much competition and not enough room for everyone to win. So if there's no more room in China, the only place to go is outside of China. Once production grows beyond what the domestic market can absorb, like those 20 million cars that no one in China wants to buy, companies have to take the natural next step and go global. That's why Chinese EV companies have begun pushing to sell in Europe, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and pretty much anywhere they can. But despite their desire to sell, they have faced some major challenges. Not all governments are being quick to let them in. Chinese cars are just too good. Their pricing is lower, the features are competitive and often just better, and what really stands out now isn't just the hardware, it's the software. Modern Chinese EVs aren't just cars anymore. They feel more like a smartphone on wheels. Traditional Western automakers often rely on fragmented software from various third-party suppliers, but Chinese companies like XPeng and Huawei have developed fully integrated driving systems. The competition isn't just about engines versus batteries anymore. It's about digital experience, who controls the interface and who updates the car after it's sold. When these cars enter global markets, they're not just cheaper alternatives. They're actually a different product than what's already being sold. From a consumer perspective, that looks like progress. It's an upgrade. But from the perspective of other countries, it actually creates a different kind of pressure because they're not just competing with a new car, they're competing with a system that now spans both hardware and software. It's a system that controls production and increasingly controls the user experience. And because of that, it changes how governments respond. Tariffs start to appear, and not randomly, but as a way to slow the flow. It's a way to give local companies time to react. For example, in 2024, the European Union imposed a tariff on Chinese manufacturers based on the level of state subsidies they had received. SAIC, the owner of MG, was hit with a 35.3% tariff, while BYD faced a 17% tariff. And that's all on top of the existing 10% standard import duty. So, what's the state of the market right now? Well, the world is splitting into 2 different types of responses. In the West, the response is protection. The United States has effectively locked Chinese-made EVs out of the country with tariffs above 100%. Europe has also built a lower but still serious tariff wall, and governments are no longer only talking about unfair prices, they're talking about security as well. To them, these cars are not just cheap vehicles. They're connected machines that can collect data through cameras, maps, sensors, and cloud systems. For them, the fear is not just, what if Chinese cars destroy our auto industry? It's also, what if a foreign system controls the cars driving through our cities? To address these concerns, Chinese companies are adapting. If exporting from China triggers tariffs, they can build somewhere else. If enough of the car is built in another country, they can avoid the penalties that come with a Chinese export. That's why BYD is building in Hungary and Chery is building in Spain. A whole slew of companies are building in Mexico. Chinese EV companies are no longer just exporting cars, now they're starting to export their factories, supply chains, and software platforms. The new strategy is simple. If the door is blocked, become local. Build inside the market, hire local workers, use local trade rules, and make the Chinese EV system harder to keep out. That's all in the US and Europe, but in other countries, the story looks very different. In Southeast Asia, Latin America, and other open markets, Chinese EVs are not being treated as a threat. They're an opportunity. They're bringing cheaper cars, new factories, battery investment, and a complete EV ecosystem straight into the country. So right now, the West is building walls, but the global South is opening doors. And Chinese companies are learning how to operate on both sides. They can dominate the open markets, and they can localize inside protected markets. So after decades of trying to catch up to the traditional car industry, China successfully changed the game instead. It skipped the old system and built a new one around electric vehicles. It aligned factories, batteries, software, infrastructure, and government policy all in the same direction. It built a system that created speed, and over time, that speed became scale. Now the rest of the world is trying to respond, not just to cheaper cars, but to a country that turned industrial coordination itself into a competitive advantage. For over a century, the global car industry was shaped by the West, but the next era of the automobile may be decided in China.